The only thing I want to say for those of you who haven't come before is the mic is really for the online audience. So because we're going to be doing a lot of discussion today, I'll be the mic runner arounder. So please wait for your comment until I get the mic to you. All right. So that anybody online can also hear what you have to say. All right. Okay. Thank you. No further ado. We'll have Tony lead us off. Thanks for coming, Tony.
Good. Well, that's the time to applaud before we start. I'm going to ask for some input from you, and that's why these pieces of paper there. So we're going to pass a pen around, and whoever gets this basket last, in a little while, pass it back around so we can collect pieces of paper with it, okay? About that in a bit. Thanks for coming, being a part of the seminar today. I've titled what we're doing as digging deeper, and want us to spend our time considering a broad topic of sermons. What are sermons doing for us? What do they do for us? What do you get from sermons? And then secondly, to focus more narrowly on the sermon that we heard today. How many of you were in the first service? Anybody not in the first service? Great. I'll tell you when we're getting to the spoiler alert place, just in case you want to head out. Okay. I want to start with an anecdote because I'm a grandparent and I like to tell grandparent or grandchild stories. This is about my 7-year-old grandson whose name is Sam. Sam's a really active kid, and probably that goes without saying when you talk about a 7-year-old, but he has a brother who is 10 named Benji. And Benji is a very meticulous, orderly, quiet, introverted kid. Ben became very interested in origami this year for his Christmas gifts. He wanted origami paper, and he works with that diligently. He was here recently and he brought examples of his origami work. Sam has been repeatedly encouraged to leave Benji's origami alone. To respect that that's his special thing that he's going to do. It's not to be played with. It's not to be messed with. That's Benji's thing. And so Sam has been kind of trying to process that. And the story I'm going to tell here in a moment about Sam, I think, grows out of his the coaching he's gotten about Benji's origami. Sam approached my daughter, his mother, and said, "Mom, you know, I don't know exactly how to say this, but you know how Benji's sort of spiritual activity is origami?" She said, "Yeah." He said, "And Daddy's is sleeping? And yours is doing laundry?" Well, I think my spiritual activity is singing. So his idea, I think, is that things on which a person places a lot of focus, spends a lot of time at, jealously guards, is spiritual activity. That may be right, may be true. At UCG, we sometimes speak of ourselves as a spiritual community. And whenever new members join, we ask them, what are they looking for? Very, very often, that's what we hear. We're looking for a spiritual community. We're looking for ways to explore, develop our own spiritual lives. I don't think we necessarily talk about what that means. And there may be a reason for that. The reason, I think, is that there's a wide variety of ways that people can experience spirituality. I'm sure that even sleeping can be spiritual. Doing laundry for your family, people you love, even for yourself, can sometimes be a spiritual kind of activity, I think. And so maybe as soon as we attempt to narrow and define and say what is spiritual and what isn't spiritual, we may get off track and we may put unnecessary limits on what it means within the variety of all of our experience and sensibilities. But I think at the same time, as a general rule, we would say our weekly Sunday worship intends to support and enhance our spirituality individually and as a group. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. One of the central aspects of our weekly worship is usually a sermon offered by one of our ministers or relatively often by one of our fellow church members. Well, why do we have sermons? You know, I'm pretty sure in the earliest gatherings of the church in the book of Acts that they didn't have a sermon. I doubt it seriously, but that has developed and has become central. What do sermons do for us? What do sermons do for you? How do they assist you in the pursuit of increased spirituality or development? So that's the broad topic I want to think about before we look at Larry's sermon and think about it and how we respond to it. So I want some input on the subject. And what I want you to do, please, whether if you're on Zoom, you'll need to do this in the chat. But I want you to think of a word or a very short phrase that you can write on a little piece of paper I have that would express what spiritual component you tend to receive through sermons. It could be something like hope, it could be resolve, it could be motivation. It could even be sermons don't usually do it for me. And I think there are a lot of people in our church, especially, who would say, well, no, the sermon isn't really the thing. Worship services involve much more than sermons. And so maybe that's not the thing. But however you could kind of identify what it is that sermons add for you, and write it on that piece of paper, and we're going to collect those in a few minutes. It won't take long to do that. And Sue, if you will kind of monitor what comes in on Zoom for us. I do want to have some group sharing today, which I think we've got a small enough group that we can do that well. The only anxiety I have about that is that nobody might want to share, but we can overcome on that because I know your names and I can call on you individually. Where's our basket? Okay, once you finish, then maybe we can kind of pass that around. Jerry, what we're doing here, thank you for coming. Oh, okay, well, grab a piece of paper and you just wait. It's going to get more so. Now, I requisitioned these pens from the office without permission, so I do need to return them. Yes. Yeah. For my purposes, you're done with them at least. Susan, do you need this to write down what comes in on the Zoom? Sure, no problem. Okay, yeah. Jerry's still writing. I always got the slow group. Yeah. Well, I got, thanks. I've just set those somewhere right now. Yeah, what came in that way. Now, the exercise was for two reasons. One is to get you to think about this. And then also, I'm going to compile these. I just think it's going to be real interesting data. It may not be interesting to anybody but me, but I think that it'll be interesting. But who would be willing to share what you wrote on your piece of paper. And don't forget that we've got to do the mic for the people on Zoom.
Laughter. Laughter.
Sure, speak up so everybody can hear you.
I wrote prompt or question, and specifically not answered like in a lecture.
I wrote 2 words, insight and uplift.
I wrote that sermons are very important to me as a part of the service, for number one. And I need to feel that the sermon is talking to me and the issues in my life.
I wrote that, and most of the sermons to me are annoying. I mean, they don't reflect my values or my thoughts. Good ones like today's get me to be very reflective, thoughtful, and feel a sense of peace.
Sermons give me something to think about.
And I too said something to think about gives me a question to ponder.
Can I? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I put down ideas with a little bit of extra wording. I like it when sermons make ideas pop into my head, and I tend to kind of think it through for a few minutes and kind of whitewash the sermon out. And then after a few minutes of thinking of the idea that it gave me, then I go back into the sermon and catch up to a new one.
I put homily, which is what the Catholics use as a term for their sermon, and relating to real life spirituality, the doctrinal lesson.
I wrote, looking around the room and out the window.
Anybody over here still?
I wrote, is that on? A sermon would be or is a time for me for deep reflection and connection with myself, my purpose, my community, and our purpose. I would like it to be a place where I shift from ordinary busyness and distraction in my life, which is pretty like that's how I roll usually most of the time, to a sense of peace, hope, and clarity.
I wrote introspection, and that also includes looking out the window.
And online, it looks like we have comfort to know how others feel the same as I do. I surprised myself to realize this just now.
I think people look for different things from sermons. Certainly people get different things, and none of us get what we're looking for every Sunday, clearly. I remember when I was a college student and in the Southern Baptist tradition was also the pastor of a church where I was 18 or 19 years old. And so they had great leadership. But I remember one Sunday, an older gentleman said, well, at the end of the service said, well, I never feel like I've been to church unless I've taken a beating. So, there are people who look for that, for their own unworthiness to be reinforced through sermons too, but a lot of different things. So that's interesting to me. Now this is spoiler alert. We're going to begin to talk some about the sermon today. If you're going to hear that sermon later, this might be a detriment to you. And if you think it will be, then you can go ahead and log off, or if you're going to watch it later, or get some coffee before going into sermon. Now, Larry's sermon today kicked off our Lenten season. Lent is generally thought of as a particular season for spiritual reflection. And for some of us, a certain spiritual discipline. Larry focused attention on the biblical account of Jesus at the time after his baptism, when he went into the wilderness for a testing of his resolve and a clarification of the way he would journey forward in his life. He considered this time near the beginning of Jesus' public work as an introit, or an introduction to the journey that Jesus would take that ultimately led to the events we remember during Holy Week and at the end of Lent at Easter. So Larry told us today is another introit, a transition into Lent, a journey of 40 days plus Sundays to Easter. And he told us that the power of Easter emerges from how we enter into and prepare ourselves during Lent. I thought that was a powerful comment, and it's making me think. You know, after 70 some odd years, you've gone through a lot of Easters, and you know they're going to happen, and it's going to be really nice. But to the idea of experiencing Easter in a different way, I thought was intriguing. And one of the words I would use about sermons, whether it be the one I would have written down or not, is challenge. And I think that was the challenge that I got from today's sermon, to make this Lent lead me to something different in terms of experiencing Easter. So I want to take an informal poll. This time we're going to just do it by raising hands. Whether you're on Zoom or here in person, how many of you, prior to finding your way to UCG in your past life, would say that you observed or took some particular notice of Lent? Okay, great. Some of you did. I did not. You know, the one thing I knew about Lent was that when we got to the last 2 Sundays before Christmas, we were going to hear a lot about the crucifixion of Jesus. That was what the sermon topic was going to be. But as far as a Lenten practice or observation, that wasn't something we did. I don't know if we had a response. I don't think we did on Zoom. So some of us have had that experience, some have not. I would like to hear some of you share what has in the past made Lent a meaningful time for you. Not so that we can say, oh, you've got the answer, but so that we can say, what is there that I might learn? Larry talked about us being a community of faith and trust. And so my thought is that maybe by sharing some things that have been useful to us, the rest of us can benefit. So who would be willing to kind of talk about that? What has been useful, helpful for you as a Lenten experience?
Okay, picking up on what somebody smarter than me did, why don't we just pass the mic and just as it reaches the end of the aisle, just pass it to the other and just keep going on around back that way. I did want to say, though, chime in here that Sandy's Lenten reflections have always been really terrific and kind of get me in that meditative space.
The Lenten reflections.
I never experienced anything about Lent until coming to UCG as well. And the Lenten service and the labyrinth have been particularly meaningful. And the Taizé services, when we used to have those, were fabulous. They were very important.
Well, prior to UCG, living in New Orleans, it usually meant Mardi Gras. So thankfully, attending UCG has expanded my awareness.
I would say Lenten contemplative prayer.
When you were talking about not knowing about Lent, it reminded me of when I used to work at the Baptist church teaching English as a second language, and I got to do the little sermonettes for the language learners. And I said I was going to do it on Lent, and all the leadership of the Baptist church said, "What? we don't do Lent here. And I said, oh, well, I don't have anything planned. And they said, go ahead. We don't know anything about it.
I was raised in a Catholic family, and so we celebrated Lent, and my relatives celebrated Lent, and Ash Wednesday was a very sacred time. And I mean, as a kid, I think it was just this our parents to trying to get across the concept of thinking about others and less of ourselves, you know, by giving up, you know, either candy or helping with my sister's chores, or, you know, doing something for someone else. Not at a random time or with them nagging us, to try to take some responsibility for developing some kind of consistent practice. I never was confirmed. I never really got into the Catholic Church until then in my 30s. I was practicing over at St. Augustine's. And then I would go to services because I worked at the infirmary building. I would go to the services at noon more regularly, and would just sit more. And then I was more, I think that was the first time that I was actually intentionally doing anything spiritual. And then I would start reading the Bible more, not very consistently, but, you know, like, hey, I'm going to actually dive into Philippians, you know, and read that. So, and now I do Lenten prayer often if my schedule permits. And quite honestly, I haven't really taken those practices, like I haven't incorporated them. I think because my spiritual community, everybody was doing that, I think I just kind of glopped on a little bit more. And here, I think it's more individualistic, you know, and I drift. I drift.
Well, I learned something about Easter when I was working in the Caribbean. A friend of mine and we decided that we were getting a 4 or 5 day, you know, weekend. And so he said, let's go to Chile. And I said, I want to go to Martinique. And so we went to see our travel agent. And she said, and this would have been during Lent, you know, a couple of weeks before Easter. And she said, you're way too late. There's not a single flight anywhere in South America and in the Caribbean because everybody goes home. In other words, Christmas is not as important to the Latino, you know, countries in South America and in the Caribbean, because everybody goes home for Easter, and it is more important than Christmas to them. So I don't try to go anywhere in South America during Lent.
I guess somebody mentioned it when we had the Taizé services, and those meant a lot to me. And I'm sort of sad we don't still have them, but that's the way things go.
Well, as a Catholic upbringing and family, for me and my children prior to UCG, we would give up orange juice for Lent, and the money we would have spent on orange juice donate to I always had like what they called rice box, which is where you put your change in dollars for food support around the world. And having fresh squeezed orange juice on Easter morning was such a sweet treat, and something, you know, akin to this great gift that we've received, and a reminder, you know, in a real physical way of the beauty of this opportunity, whether it's spiritual or, you know, just enjoying nothing better than fresh squeezed orange juice.
As a child, pardon me, as a child, my tradition was AME, and in our house, I was the only child, so I had special opportunities to do extra things during Lent, and that sort of formed a part of my basis around thinking about Lent. As I got older, I became very moved by Maundy, Thursday. And I still focus, I think, more on Maundy, Thursday than almost any other part of the season.
I was raised in a Methodist church as a child, and some of you may know if the little readers or devotional things called the upper room. They provided those. This was pre-devotional reading, and I used to during Lent read those every day. During Lent, I read them all the time, but I paid particular attention to that. And then another tradition in our house was always to have hot cross buns at Easter. We had to have hot cross buns for, but as Ron said, one of the most memorable services I've ever had at this church was the Maundy Thursday service, where we were in the dark and then the lights came on. And some of you have not been a member as long enough to remember some of those. Tony, you probably do. Jared.
I remember, yeah, I got introduced to this church because I was asked to help conduct a Seder, a Jewish Seder on Monday, Thursday, when we were still in the other room. There's been a lot of good comments, so I'll just be as quickly as I can. Those of us who have gone to the Ash Wednesday service, I think this started out for how did we get more meaning out of the process of Lent, not just Easter? And going to the Ash Wednesday service really helped me focus on a purpose for Lent, what I would accomplish in Lent, what would Lent mean to me, and those sort of things. And as a way of a little commercial, mostly over the years, it's been Sandy Reimer. And again, it's Sandy Reimer. Contemplative prayer is starting Wednesday night for 5 Wednesdays. If you have any time at all, do it. It's amazing. I'm not aware of Zoom. I'm not aware, but if Allison knows it's on Zoom, that's great. I know it's in person.
Okay, we've got one response. I heard of the practice of giving up something for Lent, but did not know the background behind it. So I mentioned to Daniel Webster, so I'll mention it to any of you who want to pick up on the idea today, that I think we ought to have a small group sometime led by somebody, not by me, on spirituality for dummies. Could call it something else. Spirituality for non-mystical people, that kind of thing. Because while I consider myself a person of faith, I feel a real commitment to the work of the church and to our community, but I struggle with spiritual activities. I've at various points in my life tried to be a really faithful person in prayer, and I've done that. And I have occasionally become pretty regular in reading devotional materials and those sorts of things each day, but somehow it never has really taken for me. And that's a confession. I regret that. But I struggle with it. And I wonder how at this point in my life, am I going to be able to enter into this Lent in a way that deepens my sense of spirituality? Now, I do believe that there are a lot of ways of being spiritual. And so I've come to believe that time that I spend in my backyard watching the hummingbirds and those kinds of things, that can be spiritual activity. I believe that conversations with people and the way I interact with people can be spiritual. But in terms of the more meditative, the more inner kind of spirituality, I struggle with that. Does anybody else have that experience? I'm glad to be around people who have more success with that. You want to speak about that or not? Just say that at least good. I'm not totally by myself. Okay. You want to speak to it?
I've been thinking about spirituality in 2 different ways. One, when I hear about the Hindus or the Buddhists who are sitting on a cushion and chanting or dancing, I think, oh, they have this process that they're using to be spiritual. And the kind of spiritual that I try to be is, I don't really do that very much, but in every activity, having a conscious purpose of being honest, trying to be gentle, which is the hard part for me, and being present. And so I'm not doing something special where it looks like I'm spiritual. I'm just trying to live my life in that way.
I don't normally use the word spiritual, but it's so prevalent that you just kind of translate it into something. My practice is mostly Buddhist, and in the defining thing about, well, the Buddha was supposedly asked one day, "Are you a god or are you a man?" And his answer was, "I'm awake." And to me, being awake and being present and being conscious is maybe the equivalent of the word spiritual.
I just equate spiritual to love. You know, I have this debate with my teenagers all the time. You know, what's God? You know, love. Do you believe that there's such a thing as love? That seems to be relatable.
Sorry. Question is, how do we feel about Larry's introduction to us? The challenge that I heard in his comments about using this 40-day journey to actually create a difference at its culmination, so that Easter means more to us because of that journey. Ron?
What I found provocative about this morning's sermon, is even though Larry talked about looking outside at his yard and looking all around us at nature, I wonder, the wilderness may not be inside, and going inside and looking at that and experiencing that and coming out of it may not be worth a Lenten trip.
I thought it was interesting because I had always read the temptation stories and seen the wilderness as a very hostile environment, you know, the desert out in the, you know, you out there suffering, and to see that as nature and the way that we appreciate nature gave me a little bit different cast on that. But dealing with those inner struggles still is the central part. You don't have to be in an awful place to do that, though. Other comments? Yes, Ann.
I appreciate Larry offering some inclusion for agnostics. I've always appreciated that. And I also resonate with what somebody said about not feeling very spiritual or not having much luck with that. But what's fun for me right now is trying to eat outside. I think that's a profound spiritual practice as far as I go. It's extremely inconvenient and eye-opening. Try it if that appeals to you, eating meals outside.
Okay, that's really all I have for today. We're a few minutes early, but if there are any other comments or thoughts that anybody wants to share, that's great. I don't mind ending a little early.
One year at UCG, we as a group gave up using plastic bags. And that was quite a Lenten hardship of walking into Publix without my carry-out bags and going, okay, I'm either gonna walk out to my car and get them, or I'm gonna drive all the way home and get them, or I'll just wait till another time. And it was quite, I think for me, the Lenten journey is having a conscious sacrifice. And it's hard to decide what that is. Orange juice sounds like a manageable one. The plastic bags, I think I'm going to try that. Thanks.
Point to say one thing about the plastic bags. I'm terrible about forgetting. You know, my wife is very good about taking the reusable ones, and I forget to do that. But the first few times at Publix, and you may have had this experience too, years ago, that we said, no, we brought our own bag. They looked at us like we were crazy, right? Now they're actually encouraging people. So those little things have made a difference over time, maybe not a huge difference, but I suspect that they wouldn't be encouraging people if there hadn't been people who were encouraging them to cut back on the plastic some.
Thank you for this opportunity to have a safe space to talk about some of the reasons that UCG is such a valuable place for all of us to be able to speak openly about faith and spirituality.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Say in the bigger picture, kind of circling back to what Tony was saying very early on about what do sermons mean to you, that the seminar committee has decided to try to sponsor a couple of seminars where what we do is directly have a discussion of what the sermon was following the sermon. So just know that those are coming. Okay. So keep an eye out for them. Yeah,